Welcome to The Explainer. You know all the stuff we use every day? Well, today, we're going to peel back the label and see where it really comes from. We're going on a journey, tracing things back to their source to figure out the true cost. And I'm not talking about the price tag.
Okay, let's just jump right in. This quote from IBM, wow, it really nails a huge paradox of our time, doesn't it? I mean, think about it. All the gadgets that power our world, our phones, our EVs, they all need stuff like cobalt. But here's the catch. Digging that stuff out of the ground often comes with a really, really high cost, a cost that's paid by the people and the land where it's found.
And look, this isn't just about mining. Take a look at this number, over 2 million. That's the estimated number of Uyghurs who have been forcibly relocated into labor camps. And here's the part that should really make us all pause. Researchers have found that over 2,000 multinational companies, big, well-known companies, have links to these camps somewhere deep in their supply chains.
So it all leads to this massive question, right? When you click Buy Now on something, what are you actually buying into? What's the real story behind that package that shows up on your porch? Well, the answer is buried, hidden inside this incredibly complex, and often totally invisible, global web.
All right, so let's start untangling that global web. The big question here is, why is it so hard to see the problems? Well, to get at that, we've got to try and unravel this thing we call the modern global supply chain. It's this tangled mess of connections that's so complicated and, frankly, sometimes deliberately murky that huge issues can just hide right out in the open.
Okay, so think of a supply chain like a family tree, but for a product. You've got these layers or tiers. Tier 1, that's your direct supplier, the company you write the check to. Easy enough. But what about their supplier? That's Tier 2. And what about their supplier's supplier? That's Tier 3 and beyond, and that's usually where you get down to the actual mines and farms. And here's the key. With every single step you take away from the finished product, it gets darker and darker. The visibility just plummets.
You've heard of 6 degrees of separation, right? Well, this is kind of like that, but for global business. And it's way more sobering. Research found that the average European company is less than 3 steps away from a potential violator, someone involved in human rights abuses or environmental damage. Let that sink in. They probably have no idea, but that connection is scarily, uncomfortably close.
And this brings us to what you could call a regulatory paradox. It's a huge problem. See, a company can look totally clean on paper because they're vetting their direct Tier 1 partners. But the really nasty stuff, the biggest ethical time bombs, are almost always ticking away way down in those deep, dark tiers of the supply chain, the very places that most rules and regulations just don't touch.
Okay, let's make this real. Here's an example from the car industry. A big car brand, right? They buy parts from a company called the Mint Group. That's their Tier 1. Simple. But wait, where does Mint get its aluminum? From a smelter. And where does the smelter get its raw materials? From a mining group in the Uyghur region. And that specific group has been directly tied to forced labor. So boom, just like that, in a few steps you can't even see, a shiny new car in a dealership is connected to some of the worst human rights abuses happening today. So, how in the world do we fix this mess? Well, let's look at the toolbox for transparency and see how governments and companies are even trying to tackle this. The goal is to drag these problems out of the shadows and into the daylight.
First up, policy. Governments are stepping in. Take the EU's new directive, the CS3D. It's a mouthful, I know, but what it does is pretty simple and pretty radical. It says to big companies, hey, you're not just responsible for your own factory, you're legally on the hook for what happens all the way down your supply chain. This is a huge, huge shift toward real accountability.
And it's not just governments. Companies themselves are starting to draw up their own game plans. They're doing things like trying to map out every single supplier, conducting these intense risk checks, and really trying to shine a light on their own blind spots. It's a proactive push to get a handle on their own massive, tangled networks.
And of course there's tech. And this is where it gets pretty cool. Take blockchain. It can basically create a digital passport for a raw material. So imagine a piece of cobalt from a mine. It gets a digital stamp. When it goes to the smelter, another stamp. To the battery factory, another stamp. This passport can't be forged or changed, so you end up with this rock-solid, trustworthy record of exactly where that material has been, from the ground to the gadget. We've talked about all these tools, audits, new laws, fancy tech. But here's the thing. Beyond compliance, what if we change the goal entirely? What if all these tools are just putting a Band-Aid on a system that's broken at its core? What if the problem isn't just that we can't see everything, but that the entire system is aimed in the wrong direction?
And that leads us to a really uncomfortable question. Think about it.
If the entire engine of our global economy is built to do one thing, maximize profit, maximize efficiency, are rules and reports in tech really going to fix it? Or are we just tinkering with a sputtering engine, trying to quiet the noise, instead of asking if we need a whole new engine altogether?
Well, there are some pretty radical alternative ideas out there. One is a framework called Anima Gaia, and it suggests we need a completely different starting point. It's a worldview that basically asks us to completely reframe how we see the planet, not as a warehouse of resources for us to take, but as a single, living, interconnected being that we're supposed to be stewards of.
And out of that big idea comes a surprisingly simple test. A single question you could apply to literally any business decision. Forget about quarterly earnings or growth projections for a second. Just ask this. Does this action increase the love of life? And that means life for everyone. Humans, animals, ecosystems, the whole shebang.
So this really presents us with two different paths forward: efficiency versus ethics. We're looking at two paths to a better supply chain, and they could not be more different.
So let's break it down. On one hand, you've got the EU regulatory approach. It's pragmatic. The goal is to make the current system work better, secure materials, make it more sustainable, and basically just minimize the harm we're doing. But on the other hand, you have the Anima Gaia framework. This isn't about tweaking the system, it's about changing its entire purpose. It says we should only take from the Earth as a last resort, after we've tried everything else. Its goal isn't just to minimize harm, but to actually promote the flourishing of all life.
So when you boil it all down, the real takeaway isn't just about how supply chains work. It's about a fundamental choice that we all face. Do we just want a system that's a little bit better at managing the damage it does? A system that simply reduces harm? Or do we want to aim for something bigger? A system that's totally redesigned from scratch to actively create well-being for everyone and everything? And that really leaves us with the final and maybe most important question of all. What standard should we demand for the world our own consumption creates?